of Client Partnerships at Pacific Cascade Legal. I'm here with licensed family and marriage therapist Sue Horton to discuss the irreparable damage that parental alienation can have on a family after divorce and what to do when you see it happening. So, Sue, before we start in, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you kind of got to be what you're doing now?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also happen to be the former director of a therapeutic boarding school for troubled teens. So I have extensive experience working with families in crisis for many, many years, hundreds of families. And of course, what I see over time are patterns, familiar patterns of dysfunction. And this is one of them. So I wanted to talk to you about it. It is probably the most underrated form of abuse that goes on in a family when a couple is going through a divorce.
Yeah, it was kind of fascinating because, we kind of touch on it on some things. Well, and, the judge always says, don't say bad things, about the other parent and that kind of stuff. But it feels like it goes a little bit beyond that. And so I'm going to start with the obvious question, which I always do, is, what really is parental alienation?
Yeah, it's when one parent, starts bad mouthing the alienated parent by sharing what I would term intimate aspects of why the relationship failed and what's wrong with that other parent on a level that child really doesn't need to know about and shouldn't know about, quite frankly. They shouldn't be really involved with that. And parents tend to do it inadvertently, I think, to begin with, and then that child changes sort of their role and becomes more of a friend and a person you vent to, and you lose sight of the fact that child is that alienated parent's child too, and you're really putting that relationship at risk for a lifetime of difficulty.
And it's exactly like that, like you're talking about. You just sort of get into this, becomes your little individual therapist. So it's not, I'm assuming that there's not an age where the child is suddenly, oh, okay, it's okay to do this. I mean, it feels like this is not good, no matter if they're 2 or if they're, 18.
Yeah, I even believe as a young adult, they're already experiencing, that lack of foundation that comes with two parents divorcing. You're already feeling unstable. You'll see, no matter what, you'll see some sense of responsibility that the child takes on for that disconnect, that relationship coming to an end. So this just adds insult to injury in terms of the child's positioning in that disconnect. They feel even more responsible for taking care of the parent that's bad-mouthing the other parent, because they're bringing up all the reasons why they no longer love that parent or care about and want to be with that parent. And you start to see all forms of behaviors that come out in that child where they don't want to be around that parent. And that's really the telltale sign that something like this is going on. And by the way, it's not something that is necessarily publicized. It can be a family, an intimate secret in the family, right? So it wouldn't necessarily come up at a judgment, for example, that's going on. It's sort of a private kind of understanding sometimes with the parent, that's doing it, and the child. Let's keep this as, between us. We're buddies here, and you're really removing that child from being, you're really crossing boundaries that you shouldn't cross as a parent.
You say, and we'll talk a little bit about your book because it was really kind of cool, but you talk about how this toxic environment is created. And so it sounds like it's not just affecting the kid, it's affecting everybody. It's like it just sort of spreads.
Well, that child is confused by it. Think about it from that viewpoint, how confusing that would be to suddenly see a part of your parent that you never knew about, and a negative part that you it's sort of been kept from you because it's, was part of the relationship, and it was private to the relationship. And now you're giving them a view of that parent that really, it's really destructive on so many levels, especially if it's the same gendered parent, for example, because that's their role model. That's their original role model. And it will impact all their relationships moving forward, their friendships, as well as their intimate potential marriages and relation, primary partners in life. They'll lack trust. They'll lack that sense of security that comes with, knowing that parent's whole and reliable. You're undermining all those pieces and parts of that foundation that's so essential in a developing child. Even in a young adult, by the way. That's especially when they're vulnerable, in my opinion. And I see it over and over again,
Oh, I imagine, and it's funny because you say, you say this is abuse. This rises to that level. And, in family law cases and in sort of the general concept that people have of child abuse is just, someone hitting a kid. But it doesn't have to be that to be abuse.
Right. It's an emotional form of abuse. And it's really, again, and I put it in the chapter called ambiguous abuse, because there are abuses that we aren't even aware that we're, perpetuating in a system, a family system. And this is one of the ones that really stood out for me because I saw it so many times, especially kids coming into the school, the therapeutic school, where the parents were either going through a divorce or about to go through. And typically there was that going on, as well as the child's issues. And again, that's another important point, that we see issues emerging from this sort of behavior around depression, anxiety, self-loathing. The child's sense of self diminishes, their sense of stability, all the things that we could avoid if we just, as that parent, went to a professional and got professional help. And vented these emotions with adults and, safe friends, for example, rather than your children.
The effect, we talk about the effect of this child's kind of behavior, and what are some of the behavioral changes that you see in the children? I mean, what kinds of things do they start doing that this, are like, you go, this isn't right?
Yeah, they have an emotional cutoff with that alienated parent. So they, again, the bond, that original parent-child bond, is severed typically. You'll see an inverted hierarchy where the child will start parenting that alienated parent and telling that alienated parent what to do and how they should treat maybe the other parent. So it's really distorted thinking going into place around relationships in general. Sometimes we see some trauma with the allied parent, where they're playing out some version of their unresolved trauma in the relationship with the child, which is, again, so distracting and distorting for that child and confusing. You also see the absence of empathy toward that alienated parent. So they stop caring. That parent's going through a lot too. Both parents are experiencing grief to some capacity. So there's just, it's again, it's very toxic and destructive. And I just highly recommend, when you're going through a divorce, please don't badmouth or complain to one of your children, no matter how old they are.
Can this affect the physical connection as well? I mean, it because we hear a lot, well, my son doesn't want to come visit me because my spouse is saying things about me. I mean, it seems like it could even be like this physical break.
Absolutely. The bond is physical as well as emotional. So yes, you see that a lot with younger kids, where they don't want to be hugged or they don't want to be touched anymore by the alienated parent. It's terrible. And then there's, trying to repair it which is a lot of the work I do. Unfortunately, people are coming to me after this impact and saying, can we fix this relationship? It's very difficult to reestablish trust, in love, even, that this can just do real damage to the foundational elements of that relationship with that parent.
it can it go like, I want to say generational. I know you use the term multi-generational, but it seems to me that when this happens, it can be toxic for the grandparents, it can be toxic for the parents, the kids. The kid may go to school and start to, this is like a
Yeah,
toxicity that can spread.
it goes everywhere. You're right. And that's exactly correct. It destroys the family, the sense of family, the sense of unity, stability, foundation in the family overall. You're right. It is generational. And even honestly, it can affect that child's children. It can be brought down that way. Because they're learning a kind of a distorted attachment bond with an allied parent that is, becoming friends with them when they still need parenting themselves.
Right. Yeah.
So that takes years to, they're going to be in therapy. I can tell you that child's going to be in therapy, or not be able to have a relationship with an intimate, or even friendships are tough, by the way,
Yeah, even with probably their friends.
Yes,
I can see that.
yeah,
Because all those things you talk about, low esteem, lack of trust, depression, that affects your work relation with everything. So what do you, let's say you are the parent being disaffected. You are the one sort of being alien, cut off.
it's an impossible place, let me tell you.
Where do you start? I'm assuming we can come to someone like you. But if I walk in and I go, I don't know, I think this maybe, kid doesn't want to talk to me anymore, says these things about me that I don't know how they found out. All that kind of stuff. Where do you, and I say, what do I do?
Yeah, I do like to meet with the child first to find out their distorted view, I'll call it, of that person, that parent, and then I just start dismantling those those ideas, and help that child to see that other parent is a whole person. They're not just the pieces that were introduced, and again in a distorted, destructive way, and maybe I even help that child to see that parent as more of, separate from them. Because the other thing that goes on is that child becomes codependent, right? Because they're trying to fix and make things better with the allied parent. They're trying to save the allied parent. They're trying to protect the allied parent from hurting and crying and feeling sadness. It's a terrible place to put a child in, no matter what, by the way, even if they're in the 30s, So I try to get, my work is with that child first and foremost, because they're the ones that have been told lies, basically. Maybe not lies, but they're certainly not the places and parts of that other parent's, character that they'd want to look at singularly, So I try to create a whole person, and then I get them back together with that alienated parent, and we start, talking about repair and forgiveness. It's a lot of work, but also realizing that the allied parent was perhaps more broken at that time. And it's usually a few years later, by the way, that this can even occur. Usually that child's, been disconnected for years, before there's even any hope of repair work. Usually, though, I will tell you that there is there's something in the child, in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, that misses that parent, because there was an original bond, and they do see that parent, as a significant person in their lives. So I always hold out hope for forgiveness as my go-to. And I work really hard on those relationships because I know how important they are. And when they do repair, and there's all kinds of changes in that. There's all kinds of good that can come from that. That's the other side of it.
So I think one of the takeaways I just got from this is that this is not something that, is necessarily fixed, while the kid's 9 or 10, or can be, but it's kind of never too late, kind of a thing. I mean,
I don't think so. And that's a really good point that you make, and important because I know the parents out there that have been the alienated parent and, have given up essentially on connecting with their children. I can tell you from experience that many, many, many people have come to me and we've done that repair work. If you're willing to, it's hard. I mean, they're really hard on you. The kids are really hard on you to begin with. But if I can dismantle that delusion or illusion that parent is only that negative picture that child has, and it's easy to do, by the way, because it wasn't truth. It wasn't the whole truth. And you can absolutely go to the fact that other spouse was broken and in pain. And sometimes, by the way, you can get that spouse that did that damage to come in and say they're sorry as part of their work.
I was just going to ask that. I was going to say, that parent who's doing it has issues, obviously, and needs some help. Is that something that, they all can be part? I don't know if they do it together or not, but are they generally separate therapists, or could it be the same therapist?
Well, in my work, different therapists do different things. I'm a great believer in the whole system being in the same place at the same time for things like this, because that's where you can get the whole truth, by the way, because you separate them out, everyone's going to have their version, in somewhat distorted version in most cases. So this is something I would meet with them separately to begin with to get their version, because that's important to understand and know. Going into this kind of work. But then I'd have to see hope of, by the way, forgiveness on everybody's part. And for there to be a real intention around wanting to heal and wanting to forgive and wanting to move forward from that original, damage for everybody.
Are there triggers you find that make someone do this? Is it like out of shame they're covering up, or maybe they feel they got the short end of the stick, or what kind of drives people to do this?
I do think it's the victim typically in the relationship. So the person left, I'll call it, the decision maker is usually the stronger person in the scenario. And so the victim stays in that loop, of denial that they had really anything to do with it. And then they start blaming and shaming, which is where this comes from. And they hide, behind something that, makes them look better. And this also contributes toward that. So there's a real disconnect with them taking responsibility for their part in the divorce, in the separation, and why it came to that. And I think the shame is around the fact that they failed with their kids, that they've done something to fail their children. And so they want to come out looking good as being it wasn't my fault. It was all your other parents' fault. And so some of it comes from just staying in that victim loop. And it really isn't until that spouse realizes, that's why I so emphasize self-awareness in my book. I think when you become aware that you're doing this, and I have found this with some of the parents that are doing it, like they didn't realize that they were causing so much damage. So sometimes even that piece, creating that awareness can, set off a light bulb and get some movement around change. And that hopefully that allied spouse will start to realize and get up to that accountability loop where you own your part, and then we can go toward forgiveness. And learn from it all, and hopefully move forward in positive directions for everybody. That would be my goal. Yeah.
Is this something that can smolder? We sometimes see where what seems to be a pretty good relationship just breaks down maybe 10 years later, 5 years later, or after a new person comes into the family mix. And suddenly the one of the spouses starts to do this kind of stuff. They start to, badmouth when they really didn't before.
I think it happens early, quite frankly. I see it like in the rawness of a divorce, when the shock, kind of the grief period, the angry, I see it more there. If anything, I see the shift toward wanting to heal, or seek forgiveness, I'll call it. I see that when the allied spouse has maybe remarried, maybe gotten some help and gotten more stable themselves. They can also see the impact that it's had on their children, not having the other spouse, not being connected to the other spouse, or the ex-spouse, I should say, the other parent. And I think it's where it might be a wake-up call of sorts, especially if that child's experiencing some significant mental health issues, for example. They could see that maybe that's part of the reason why for the first time. And they will seek some kind of way to heal that relationship as a result. But I don't see it as a later on, unless something emerges after the separation, like, somebody maybe gets together with an old friend, for example, and there's a reason to ignite anger toward the ex-spouse. Maybe you'd see it there, but I have seen it pretty consistently in early on in a divorce process, even when by the way, the parents are both still in the same home, getting ready to separate.
Yeah.
You can see it there. Anyway.
So this is something to be aware of, like right off the bat. I mean, it's something that everyone should, or at least if they can start to see, this is what it might be. What do you end up telling a parent, though, who is engaging in these behaviors? I mean, what can you say to them? How do you start them to stop doing this if you can?
I think it's awareness first and foremost, making them aware. And I can do it through the child if there's because usually I'm seeing the identified child and their behaviors are a result of something like this, for example. So I'll be able to go back to the parent when I bring the parent in to say, like, well, do you realize that you were bad mouthing the dad or the mom or whatever, and just really bring it to light that way. And I would absolutely look to find a way toward healing and repair work, because there's a ton of repair work that has to go on, and after this has gone on for a few years. I would also highly recommend that parent see a therapist where they can vent those harder emotions with the therapist, a professional, rather than their child. I'd certainly ask them to stop doing it right away if I saw it happening. And I'd be really clear and concise about that's what's happening. You need to stop this. You don't cross those boundaries. It's toxic. It's destructive. Yeah.
Wow. We just blew through almost 30 minutes. This was really, really interesting. Yeah. But
Good.
Before we go, I do want to give you obviously the opportunity to maybe talk a little bit about the book you've written about this. And if someone is maybe wanting to get a hold of you, let them know how they can do that.
Yeah. So I have written a book called Raising a Resilient Family, how to create strong communication and connection in a deeply distracted world. You can find it on Amazon and Audible. My website is www.raisingaresilientfamily.com. And my direct email is sphorton915@gmail.com. And you're welcome to send me questions or ask me about the book. But the book really contains it's very much solution oriented. It gives parents ideas and strategies on how to create conversation, deeper dives into, what's going on with a child, how to emotionally connect with a child when they're, hiding out in their rooms on video games, for example. I've worked with hundreds of families in crisis, as I said, but I've also worked with families in my private practice where they were just looking for ways to prevent the disconnection from emerging as they saw their young middle-aged kids going into high school. That's where you start to see it. I'm sure you parents can know exactly what I'm talking about there. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways. And I talk about listening. I talk about accountability and self-awareness a lot. It's really a foundational piece in the book.
I love that. I love that. And I love the idea you said, help prevent it. I mean, just kind of learn about what it does before you start doing it. Because like I said, some people may not want to do it. It's their natural. I mean, they just kind of are mad and they do it. But we have to go.
Okay.
But before we go, thank you again for being here, Susan, to sit down and talk with us today about, parental alienation, something a lot of people don't understand, the damage it can create. And you said in such a clear manner, and this is kind of high level stuff, kind of brain-wise, but you really bring it to a point where we understand it, even me. So that's always good. Yeah. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was great. And thank you everyone for joining us. Anyone with further questions on the topic can post it here and we can get you connected with Sue. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and be well.